Alright, so layers will really round out this chapter, as it's basically the other window I have on screen at all times. In Photoshop, when you make a new canvas like I just did here, it starts you off with a background. A background is simply a canvas set to white in this case, and it's just the single default layer you start with. To make a new layer, click this little button here. And remember that checkerboard thing that I said signifies transparency? Well, layers always come in transparent. If I were to hide the background by clicking this eyeball, you can see that my entire canvas is now that checkerboard, implying that this whole thing is transparent. I'll just go get a brush here to paint with. When you have a layer selected, you can paint on it. Oh, and by the way, in my layers view, I like to go in here, click on panel options, and by default, Photoshop will be on this one. I like to increase the box size. This is how Photoshop will display your layers in the layers window. And also, I change it from entire document, which is the default, to layer bounds. See, if it's on entire document, it shows the whole canvas in this tiny thumbnail. But I only want to know what's on my layer. So going back in here, change it to layer bounds, it clips it to just these blue brushstrokes I just made. If I made more brushstrokes up here, my graphic would update accordingly. Okay, I'll reveal the background layer by simply clicking its eyeball. And just for fun, let's put a few brushstrokes on it. First of all, notice it goes behind layer 1 because it's underneath it here in the layers window. If I were to select layer 1 just by clicking on it, go to my move tool, I could move this around. I could also push Ctrl T and rotate it and scale it and do all the things we saw in the tools section of this class. And of course, I could just click this button again to make another layer, paint on it, and do all the same stuff. If I wanted layer 2 to be underneath layer 1, just drag it down there, and there you have it. Layers become really handy when you want to apply filters. So if I have layer 1 selected and I go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, I can blur just that layer. To merge layers, hold Shift and select the layers you want to merge and push Ctrl E. Or I could select the two of them and go to Layer, Merge Layers. If I wanted to merge every layer, I could go to Layer, Flatten Image. And now everything gets collapsed into that one background layer. Of course, when layers are collapsed like that, you can no longer edit them individually. There is no restriction as to the amount of layers you can have, although I suppose an artificial restriction would be the speed of your computer. Generally, the more layers you have, the more computationally expensive it is. Now, you might wonder, how many layers do I like to work on? Well, here's one of my paintings, and I just did this on 2 layers, and this layer is a paltry little foreground element. Just like I showed you here, I painted these foreground trees on a layer so that I could kind of blur them out to imitate a camera's depth of field or something. But this entire image was painted on just the background layer. You absolutely do not need layers in digital painting. But let me show you a few cool things you can do with layers. First of all, this layer is locked with this lock icon. When a layer is locked, you cannot move it, you cannot paint on it. As you can see, I just got an error there. So let me just unlock it like this. One handy little box you might want to check is this one. This locks the transparent pixels, which is just a fancy way of saying that if I painted now on this layer with this button checked, it only affects the pixels that are on this layer. So let's say I wanted to make these trees darker in parts. I could do it much more easily than if I didn't have this on a layer. Let's go back into our original image here. On this layer, if I click the Lock Transparent Pixels button, and let me go grab a softer kind of airbrushy type brush, I could like make this little bit darker here with a nice gradient, or add a little streak of red to it here. So it kind of uses the layer information as a stencil, and you can paint perfectly into it. It's a very nice feature. These other buttons here, like this paintbrush one, means I can no longer paint on this layer. If I click this one, it locks my ability to move it. Like I could not move that layer anymore, but I could paint into it. I don't use these ones that much. The only real ones I use are Lock Transparent Pixels and the actual lock button, which means I can't do anything to that layer, except for turn it on and off. To get rid of layers, I'll unlock this, and you have this little trash can icon here. To delete them, I think by default Photoshop will give you a warning asking if you want to delete. You can disable that warning. You can't delete the background layer. You always need at least one. I could make a new layer and then delete the background layer, but you always have to have at least one layer here in the layers window. To rename a layer, simply double click on it and you can type a layer name. One very common way to use layers is to have like a pencil drawing and then a layer underneath to fill in a color. If I hold Control and click the new layer button, it comes in underneath, and I can switch to my paint bucket tool, grab a color, and fill it in. But no, it fills the entire layer. I have to go up here and select all layers, which makes it consider the layer above it. If I were already on the layer above it, I could do that, but it's nice to have your colors on separate layers. So now that I have these two layers, if I wanted to solo one, I could hold Alt and click its eyeball button, and it only shows me what's on that layer. Still holding Alt, I could click on that one, and it only shows me what's on that layer. This is really handy when you have many layers and you don't want to spend time scrolling through them all. And by the way, this is where the lock transparent pixels might come in handy. On my color layer, if I lock transparent pixels, grabbed a brush, I could say paint a shadow onto my ball and have like a sphere. And then maybe on a layer underneath that, I could paint the sphere's shadow on the table. Painting this on a layer underneath it makes sure that that shadow goes underneath the sphere. Then maybe on a layer underneath that, I could put in a little environment like a sky here or something like that. And the ball is sitting on a desk. And there we go. I have a digital painting made of layers. You can create layer groups just to save visual space here. Like let's say I wanted the sphere to be its own group and the background to be separate. I could shift select my sphere layers, push Control G to add them to a group. And then now I have one eyeball icon that I can turn on and off, and I can unfurl that group to see its layers. Grouping layers does not affect the picture. It's simply how the layers are displayed and organized in your layers box. You can drag layers in and out of this group too. Now with a group, I could select that group and move all of its elements at once. And I could still, of course, select a single layer within that group and just move that. Speaking of moving layers, this auto select button will make it so where your mouse clicks, Photoshop auto selects that layer. This can be very handy, but also very frustrating if you don't know about it. I think by default it's on. I usually like to turn it off and select layers by hand this way. I'll just undo all that. Okay, let's talk about layer blending modes. The first thing I'm going to do on my red layer here is just select this and paint everything back to that one color. Looks like this brush has some color dynamics on, which is pretty cool. Every layer you make can have its own blending mode. Blending modes are like how the layer affects or blends with other layers. Blending modes are accessed up here. You unfurl this list and you have all of these things. As I move my mouse over them, you can kind of see what they're doing. But let me go back to normal, which is the default. That just means the color you pick is the color that shows up. So I want to add a shadow in a different way. I'll make a new layer and select a multiply blending mode. I don't know why it's called multiply, but multiply is a darkening mode. So watch this. I'll select a light color and it will still darken my image. I can go a bit darker with that color and get my shadows this way. Now this is a bit of an issue because I can paint outside the red sphere. I don't want to do that. So one handy tool to clip this to the red is to create a clipping mask. If you hold Alt and go between the layers, you get this kind of arrow icon. Once you have that, click and your layer view updates like so. And this little arrow means that the visibility of this layer is controlled by this layer. This is essentially the same thing as turning on the lock transparent pixels on this layer, except the benefit is we have this on its own layer. So I could select the move tool and move this around if I wanted. Or a very good benefit of this is I can change its color. I can do that by going to Image, Adjustments, and say Hue Saturation. And I can move this little guy around and change the color. I could change the lightness or darkness, change the saturation just on that layer. And the fact that it's set to multiply mode means it'll always go darker than the layer it's painted on. So multiply mode is a very popular way of adding shadows to otherwise flat line and color art. Okay, let's do the opposite thing and say I wanted to add a bit of a lighter part of the sphere. Well, make a new layer. I also want this layer to be clipped to the red. Another way to do that is to right click on it and say create clipping mask, and we get our little arrow updated. Now with this layer, I'll select its blending mode and change it to screen. Again, I don't know why it's called screen, but screen is a lightening mode. So if I selected my brush, maybe a different color this time, something in the greenish range maybe. I'm going to select it on the dark side, knowing that screen is a lightening mode, and it'll lighten this. If I selected a more aggressive saturated green, it'll become kind of a mixture of that green with the red, giving me this sort of yellowish thing. Let me undo that though. I'll pick more of a standard red color to match our sphere, and I can lighten the sphere. If I wanted a bit of a highlight, I'll just go much lighter, smaller brush, and I can paint in my little highlight. There are other lightening modes too. In fact, Photoshop kind of breaks things into these sections. So where multiply was, all of these go darker, just in different ways. And where the screen mode is, this section is all lightening effects. And I'm saying lightening, not lightning. They all act different ways. So color dodge maybe preserves a little more saturation in the color. Linear dodge is actually one of my favorites because it kind of acts the way you would expect real light to act. So I'll bring this painting back up. I'll make a new layer and set it to linear dodge mode. And I'll pick a color here that approximates a warm pre-dusk type sun color. Maybe a bit darker than that because linear dodge is a pretty aggressive effect. Now watch this. As I paint this color in, it really starts looking like sunlight is hitting this bridge. And maybe I can paint a shaft of light coming in this way. So the monster is like casting a shadow by way of lightening the areas around him. Maybe here too. And what's cool is because I have this on a layer, I could always go to my eraser tool and erase out. I could erase out shadows from these little headstones here. And erase out the boy's shadow there. And this brings me to the next useful thing about layers. On this linear dodge layer, let me just paint in a bunch of nonsense like this. I want to preserve some of that, but some of that I want to go away. I just showed you that I could use the eraser and erase it away, but there's actually a better way to do it, a more non-destructive way. Click this button here, and you get kind of this sub-layer. This is called a layer mask. A layer mask tells the layer what information to reveal and what information to hide, and it works with black and white. By default, the layer mask is white, which means everything is visible. But if I picked a black color here, and I could use any brush, I'll paint black into the layer mask and kind of reveal my shadows this way by essentially hiding parts of this light layer. This is another very popular way you'll see artists working all the time with these layer masks. And it doesn't have to be pure black and white. I can press softly on my tablet like I'm doing here and get kind of a gradient. Now, I called this non-destructive because my original layer, as you can see here in the icon, is still fully intact. Let's say I made my shadow too long and I'm like, oh, I want some of that light back. Well, just go to a light color like white here and I can paint that layer information back in. And again, really all I'm doing is controlling what's visible in this layer. With layer masks, you have to be careful. Right now I have my layer mask selected, but if I click here, I'm now painting into my actual light layer. So I'll undo that. Make sure if I want to paint into my layer mask, I click it and it's active. If you want to see exactly what's on this, hold Alt and click the layer mask. And this is my black and white mask that's controlling this layer. To get out of this view, you could Alt click again, or simply just click on this layer. And then you're back in your painting where you could select various layers. All right, some very handy stuff there. And you can also see how layers are more technical. But I want to remind you, I painted this entire image without any of this fancy stuff. You should experiment with it and learn it, but only use it when you feel like you need it. Layers are not a requirement. A few other things to know here. To duplicate a layer, you can drag it into the new layer box. And now I have two of these layers. The layer mode is also preserved with that duplicate. And I've essentially here doubled my linear dodge effect. If you want to reduce the strength of a layer, you have a opacity slider. By default, it's set to 100, of course, and I can just dial this down. You also have a fill box. I never use this. I'm not sure what the difference is, to be honest with you. I just use opacity. Now, let's say I wanted to merge these two linear dodge layers, and I shift selected them and pushed Control E. Well, Photoshop is not smart enough to recognize that it should stay linear dodge. It goes back to normal mode, but this is easily fixed by going right back there. And of course, if I went back to my background layer, which is underneath the linear dodge layer, any color I paint on that background will be affected by the linear dodge above it. So it's kind of a nice way of presetting your light and shadow effects, and you can do entire paintings this way. All right, let's go back to our red sphere painting. I would like to add some bounce light bouncing up into the shadows here. As we remember, my shadows are controlled by this layer, and it's always good practice to double click and rename things. Okay, so I want to paint some reflected light bouncing into that shadow. This is where I want to add just a little wrinkle of knowledge to our brushes section. Now that we're familiar with blending modes, I want to show you that the brush tools also have blending modes. And these are the exact same blending modes that are available with layers. It's just that this menu here works on the brush level. So I'm on my shadow layer, which is a multiply layer. But watch this. With this brush tool, I'll set this brush to screen, which, as you remember, is a blending mode that lightens things. So I'll pick a color here. And now with my screen brush, I'll paint into my multiply layer. Are you following this? I'm essentially lightening my layer that is darkening the red sphere. And I have my nice reflected light painted in that way. Let me just undo that. An alternative way to do that, if I wanted to keep everything on its own layer, I could make a new layer. And by the way, when I did that, this layer automatically came in with a clipping mask because it came in between two layers that have clipping masks. Let me just back up and show you. I'll delete that layer. If I were on this top layer and made a new one, this layer comes in normally, but if I, say, dragged it down here, it automatically inherits the clipping mask. Okay, I can set this layer to screen mode, and now my brush does not have to be on screen mode. It can just be on normal mode, and I could achieve the same kind of thing. And of course, having this on a layer means I could, modify it separately, like by blurring it or something like that, reducing its opacity, and I can dial it in precisely. So there is a case for putting everything on layers, but from an art standpoint, I find it really bogs me down because the technical kind of overtakes the creative. But hey, while we're here, let me show you other ways of adding to your layer stack. Let me just collapse this group here. One area of Photoshop that I've accessed before but never really talked about is up here, Image Adjustments. And you have a bunch of ways to essentially change the brightness and contrast and saturation of your picture. Hue saturation is one of the most common. I've already shown you this. You can cycle through hues and change your background colors like this. Saturation, lightness, hit OK when you're done. Another one of my favorites is exposure. This mimics a camera's exposure. So you can ramp it up, get back some of the contrast, change the gamma. This is all pretty cool. You should go in here and play with all of these, particularly these ones in the first half of the menu. They all basically do the same thing, but in different ways. Another one of my favorites, by the way, is curves, where the top of this curve controls the light pixels, the bottom of the curve controls the dark pixels, and this curve acts just like the one we saw in Krita, except here we're affecting brightness and stuff. There's a special set of layers called adjustment layers that call up those effects but embed them in the layer stack. So let me show you here. I'll click on the group and I'll make an adjustment layer above this. Adjustment layers are located here. So I just showed you the curves, right? Let me bring up curves. I now have a curves adjustment layer, and this window has popped up over here. Let me just resize it a little so we can see it. Now this does the same thing we just saw. The only difference is I now have that curves dialog box editable in my layer stack. I could just double click back into it and you can see my old setting is there. I could also hide this layer to hide the effect, or I could reduce the opacity on it to get 39% in this case of that effect. Adjustment layers also come with their own layer masks. So let's say I didn't want to adjust all of this. I could get a brush and set it to a black color, and I could paint away the changes caused by the adjustment layer. And of course, painting white will paint them back in. If I move this adjustment layer below the sphere, it's only affecting the background now. And I can, of course, double click back in and, make it more affected. You can see my strokes here, the layer mask, those are still there, causing this thing to happen. This is an area where the effect is not being shown. You could disable layer masks, by the way. Just right click and say disable layer mask. They'll draw a big X through it, and now you get the full effect. To re-enable it, just right click and say enable. That holds true with all layer masks. I could unfurl this group and put this curves adjustment anywhere I want. I could put it just above the red color. So now this curves is only affecting the red color. With curves, you can actually access red, green, blue. So if I wanted to kill some of the red of that red ball, I could pull out some of the red. And the layer mask is, of course, affecting where this effect shows up. You can see the possibility here. And this is just one adjustment layer. You can add as many of these as you want, and there's all of these to choose from. And this is what I meant in the intro when I said layer stacks. It's just how you order your layers. And hopefully you can see here how quickly layers can stack up if you let them. Okay, for now though, I'd like to move on to Krita.